So good afternoon, and welcome again to another open call. A call during which we'll talk about the small island of Sao Tome. Well, Sao Tome and Principe, they are two islands. So welcome to the third open call, and my name is Ankrita Beatrice Chaleke, and I am the serial author of the Africa for Smart Kids book series, the publisher of Lobuntu Books, and here the host of the open call, Sao Tome. And the essence of the open call, again, is to introduce you to this beautiful island that is full of history. It's so full of history, not just the history of Africa, but the history of the world. Originally, I set up this call today to share some basic facts, but as it turned out, shout out to Brenda King, Brenda, my sister in the UK. Thank you for drawing my attention to a particular book that I'm going to share with you. I'm going to put it up on the screen. Let me go find my screen because I need to tell you why we're doing this. I need to give you more background about what this particular call is about, and to do that, I need to bring something on screen. So I'm struggling because I had originally programmed something on the screen, and that one is gone. I need to go pick up this one because this is where the journey starts. So it is this one, the book that you're seeing. This is what I decided that I would like to share with you today. The book is written by Howard French, a long-term journalist, New York Times journalist who has been around the world, and he's written incredible books. And today I'm not here to review his book, no, but I just stumbled on a conversation of him about the book in YouTube, and this conversation was hosted by Adrian Howard, who is a professor at the Carleton School of Journalism and Communication. And as it so happened, this particular conversation was was live streamed on the 1st of March this year, 1st of March 2022. And my birthday is on the 1st of March. And not just that, the 1st of March was the day that I originally booked my ticket to come to Sao Tome for the first time. And because of COVID, I did not do the test, and so I could not travel on the 1st. So on this same day, this conversation was being live streamed, and Sao Tome is very central to this conversation. And the reason why I choose to share this with you instead of giving you the basic facts is because this really takes us back to history. This conversation takes us back to history and really repositions us so that every other thing that I will be learning and sharing with you about Sao Tome will stand on this solid foundation. When we all know the role that Sao Tome played in the history of the world, what Howard French calls the modern world, then you will understand how important, how critical it is for us to not just read this book, but to listen to Howard French talk about his book. And that said, I am going to take you to straight to the conversation. This open call was supposed to last for 30 minutes, but the conversation, which is really world history of the first class, is about 2 hours and 10 minutes or 11 minutes. That's how long it is. And so I will take you right there. Now, the reason why I decided to take you to the live stream and share it live with you is because if I was to tell you what Howard French is telling us in that conversation, you probably would think that I'm falsifying history, that I'm inventing history. And if I were to tell you, I probably will not be as eloquent and as clear as he is. And so I thought, why don't we go to the horse and listen from the horse's own mouth as he traces back history, 600 years backward, 600 years back, to reposition world history and to show us the role that Sao Tome played in what is called today the modern world. Okay, so you want to grab your favorite drink, you want to find a comfortable place to sit, because this is going to be a long ride, but one that is really going to open your mind and probably blow your mind about everything that you know about world history and the role of Africa. Now, when you speak about Sao Tome, you cannot not speak about Africa, right? And when you speak about Sao Tome, again, you cannot speak about Portugal. Or let's put it the other way around. If you speak about Portugal, you cannot speak about Sao Tome, because we know the role that Sao Tome played in the economic growth of Portugal since time memorial, as far back as 600 years. So let me take you to Howard French and let him share this history with you, something that I can do myself. So I am going to take the book out of the screen, and that book, you can find it in the bookstores. I guess you'll find it in every bookstore out there. It's really worth a read. I haven't read it myself, but from the conversations that I heard, the book review that I heard, the presentation that he made, I am definitely going to get this book, not just to read, but to use it as a research piece and also to share with as many people as possible, because this is the history that we should know. This is the history that is so critical that we know. Okay, so that said, allowed me to remove the book from the screen and then go get you the conversation between Howard French and Adrian Howard about, no, first I'll give you a snippet. I'll give you a snippet of that conversation, and then let me see, I'm trying to get me on the screen. I'm trying to get this on the screen. I'm struggling a little bit, you'll bear with me, but let me go share the screen, and I'm going to pick that conversation, which is right here. And we're going to start with a snippet where he will situate Sao Tome. And once we get that snippet, I will then take you back to the whole conversation so you understand what I'm trying to share with you here. Okay, so let's go listen to that piece.
Columbus, it is important to understand, had spent much of these 2 decades I've spoken about in his free time wandering the courts of Europe, trying to persuade people to back him in a venture to try to do what Abu Bakr II had done in the early 1300s, to cross the Atlantic in pursuit of discovery of new lands and hopefully of Asia. And he had been laughed out of court in one place after another. The Spanish had turned him down, the English had turned him down, the Portuguese had turned him down, possibly others had turned him down. When the Portuguese hit the jackpot in terms of establishing this enormously lucrative trade with what we're calling Ghana, the Spanish then decided, out of envy, to back Columbus. They said, well, if there's gold in tropical places like this, we can't let Portugal run away with all of the loot, speaking colloquially, right? We have to get into this game too. And so it's at that point that the Spanish reconsider and backed Columbus's ventures. This is the origin of how Columbus, A, mastered sea navigation. He was going back and forth to West Africa and understanding the Canary Current, and B, found backing for the great voyages of discovery that he would later make. All of these events have their roots in West Africa. So what were the Portuguese doing in the meantime? The Portuguese believed, much as the Spanish did, that the distribution of gold and silver and precious metals in the world, since it had been discovered in such high quantities in Ghana, maybe had something to do with geographic distribution, and that at certain latitudes on either side of the equator, close to the equator, they had this theory that there must be lots of gold. This was another sort of propelling force behind Columbus's discoveries. He thought that at such latitudes he would be able to discover gold because the Portuguese had at similar latitudes. Okay, so the Portuguese, instead of running onward to Asia, which is the normal story we are told, obsessed with getting to Asia, Africa is a mere obstacle, the Portuguese begin out of this theory of sort of the geographic distribution of gold in the tropics, exploring other parts of Africa nearby. And they would do this for the next 2 decades prior to any attempt whatsoever of reaching Asia. So we're told that Asia is everything, but nobody has paused to say, well, if Asia is everything and they finally have the ability to master sea navigation at great distance from Europe, why is it that they were hanging around in Africa not trying to get to Asia? And the reasons for that are quite interesting, and not just interesting, important, decisive in understanding the beginnings of the modern age. So the Portuguese, in a few years after establishing the trade with Elmina in Ghana, are continuing to explore, looking for gold at those latitudes. And off the coast of Central Africa, right on the equator virtually, they discover an island which we know of as Sao Tome. Sao Tome is absent from most books of world history or of the start of the modern age, but I want to argue to you is the site of the most important innovation, economically speaking, in the history of the modern age prior to the Industrial Revolution. So why do I say this?
So that is Howard French. That's the first part of that conversation with Howard French, where he is tracing us back to the role, kind of repositioning Sao Tome, right? Telling us about the role that Sao Tome played in what he calls not modern history, but what did he say? The modern world. That's what he calls it. And it is very interesting what he's going to tell us in the later part of the conversation. What happened in Sao Tome, and how that affected the rest of the world. The rest of the world. When we're talking about the rest of the world, we're talking about not just Africa, not just Europe, not just America, but specifically the transatlantic trade, transatlantic slave trade. Sao Tome was one of the first places where the plantation industry was set up. It was experimented by the Portuguese, a model that the Spaniard then picked up. The British picked up and installed exactly the same way in Barbados. And then the French followed suit, and that's how the world was changed. So it started in Sao Tome, and the first revolt of enslaved people started on the island of Sao Tome and Principe. So this island is, yes, the smallest island country the second smallest island country in Africa. It is just 1,001 square kilometers. It's a two islands, the biggest one Sao Tome and the smaller one Principe. And it is as small as it is, but it played a very, very critical role, a very crucial role in world history, in the history that we should know. And so Howard French really, really brings that out in his presentation. And that presentation is of a book that he wrote. The title of the book is Born in Blackness. And I came across that book yesterday and decided that I would change. Instead of giving you some basic facts about Sao Tome as I originally planned, I decided I should let you listen because, again, that lays the foundation. It really gives us a bigger picture of what this small country is in reality when it comes to world history and the modern world, as he calls it today, and the industrialization, and how much Africans had to build the so-called modern world. So I'm going to take you right back. Again, this is going to be a long one because this is a very interesting conversation. If you are interested in history, this is something that you don't want to miss out at. You may be doing your chores, you may be doing whatever. Just let this run in the background so that you can really pick up the critically important element of world history, of African history, of Sao Tome's history, of our human history that the author Howard French is sharing with us in this conversation with Adrian Howard, who is a professor at the Carleton School of Journalism and Communication. And again, this conversation was live streamed on the 1st of March, which happens to be my birthday, and which happened to be the day that I initially wanted to travel to Sao Tome. So there couldn't be too many synchronicities. And yesterday, my sister Brenda King called my attention to this book. And when I went in doing some research and found it, I thought, like, today is the 1st of July. So first. And this is just really something that I could not stop sharing. So you bear with me and just hang in, get your favorite drink. Let's go learn world history from the first hand, from the horse's own mouth, and from a perspective that you probably have never heard before. So you allowed me to go get the whole presentation on the screen. And please listen to him speak, but also listen to the questions. The answers that he gives to the questions that are asked thereafter, they really bring in more light, they throw more light on this part of world history that is often neglected. Neglected probably also because Sao Tome is a small island. But hey, they say small. I mean, in Cameroon they say small no be sick. It means don't underestimate something that is small. I did not know the scope of world history. So I'm super, super delighted to share with you. Maya Angelou said, when you learn, teach. And so I'm learning and I'm happy to share with you. When you take this history, please share with your people. You will find this conversation with the author on YouTube as well. So I'm sharing straight from the screen. Thank you so much to the Carleton School of Journalism and Communication for having conducted this book presentation, this conversation. And I mean, I hope you don't mind me sharing this because it's just too powerful to keep for myself. So that said, I am going to load it on my screen. Let's go share the screen. And then we will start it all over again. And then you will learn world history from a completely new perspective. And you'll see how important it is that we know Sao Tome, not just as a holiday destination, not just as a small island on the continent, not just as one of the world's largest producers of cocoa, but for the role that it played in history and a role that is irreversible. So I am on my screen. I am picking up that conversation. And here we go. I am going to get myself off the screen because this conversation is so powerful. You need to see it in full length. So let's go listen to the author, Howard French.
Coming to you from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe. I'm honored to be the moderator for this evening's Black History Month event, featuring the distinguished author, journalist, and professor of journalism at Columbia University, Howard French. This event is hosted by the School of Journalism and Communication in partnership with the Institute of African Studies, the Bachelor of Global and International Studies, and the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. This has truly been a collaborative effort. I'd like to pick.
So before we continue, I just want to add that we are streaming live on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Facebook. We're streaming live on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Insta and YouTube. So we're taking comments. If you have any comments, please drop them. I'll pick them and then share with you. If there are any questions, please drop them. Use the comment box. And if you like this, please make sure to share and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you more of this kind of historical information. So let's go back to history right now.
Special thanks to the Journalism School's director, Alan Thompson, for his work in helping to make tonight's event a reality. And also I'd like to recognize Jenna Lynn Smith, the graduate administrator at the school, whose tireless work behind the scenes has been invaluable. Also, a big thank you to our School of Journalism and Communication colleagues and those of the Faculty of Public Affairs for their support. It is, of course, the 28th day of February, the final day of Black History Month, and I think in this instance, we really have saved the best for last because Howard French is one of the best. By any measure, Howard French has had one of the more remarkable careers in journalism. He came to public consciousness as a reporter and foreign correspondent for the New York Times. He began his career as a freelance reporter for the Washington Post. He joined the Times in 1986 and worked as a Metro reporter there for 3 years. And then from 1990 to 2008, he reported overseas for the Times as a bureau chief for Central America and the Caribbean, West and Central Africa, Japan and the Koreas, and also in China, where he was based in Shanghai. And during this time, he was twice the recipient of an Overseas Press Club Award. Between 2005 and 2008, he was a columnist on global affairs for the International Herald Tribune. Howard French's journalism continues to be featured in such publications as the New York Review of Books, the Times Literary Supplement, The Guardian, and the Atlantic Magazine. He's the author of 5 books, including 3 works of nonfiction and a work of documentary photography. His book, Everything Under the Heavens, How the Past Helped Shape China's Push for Global Power, was published in 2017, and it was featured by The Guardian as one of its notable books of the year. His book, China's Second Continent, How a Million Migrants Are Building a New Empire in Africa, was published in 2014, and it was named one of the 100 notable books of 2014 by the New York Times. Howard French is also the author of A Continent for the Taking, The Tragedy and Hope of Africa, which was named Nonfiction Book of the Year by several newspapers in 2004. His latest book is called Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans in the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War. The book is a bold, unapologetically ambitious project that sets out to fundamentally reframe our understanding of world history by placing Africa and Africans at the very center of the making of the modern world. Howard French's talk tonight is entitled Born in Blackness, and then following his presentation, the two of us will have a conversation about the book, his career journey, and then thanks to his expertise in global affairs, we will also chat a bit about the current state of geopolitics. Our conversation will be followed by a question and answer session in which we will take your questions and comments. But without further ado, please welcome to Carleton and to the nation's capital, to Ottawa, Howard French. Howard, welcome, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for such a generous introduction, Adrian. It's a great pleasure to be with you and with all of you. I'm sorry that it's in this disembodied way. My preference would be to appear before a live audience and to be able to get to know each other that way and to have a more intimate kind of exchange. But here we are on Zoom, and I'm going to get right into it. So, Adrian, in your presentation of my career and mention of the book's title, you emphasized in ways that I found a little surprising, but in the positive sense of the word, Africa and Africans. And this is something I find myself emphasizing constantly when I speak about the book. And I hope to make clear to the audience why both of those words were necessary in the title of the book as we proceed. I also want to dwell for a moment and in fact begin by talking about what I mean by the making of the modern world. Modernity is one of these concepts that social scientists love to debate and to split hairs about and to interpret in various ways. I'm going to use this term in a way that will be familiar to the broadest possible audience and sort of refer to what the image that I have, not just based on supposition, but actually on research that I did in the work on this book, about how we as Westerners typically learn about how we arrived in the present moment, how, in other words, the modern world was built. And this narrative has some very particular features which seem so permanent as almost to be written in stone. And so I'm going to try to limn some of the principal elements of these features, and I think they'll be familiar to you because they're so near universal. And then I'm going to attempt to deconstruct them a bit in the way that the book itself deconstructs them or works to deconstruct them. So the modern age, in the sort of traditional way we are all taught, even if that word, whether or not that word or that phrase is used, begins, I think, in this notion that Europe, and in specific a part of Europe called Iberia, and most specifically a nation in Iberia called Portugal, was obsessed at a particular moment in time with discovering a maritime route to Asia. That Asia was thought back then, and we can situate this moment in time, in the 15th century, Asia was thought to be the center of action in terms of wealth and sources of lucrative trade goods in the world. And therefore, the Portuguese, being a very young and poor kingdom, were obsessed, according to the standard storylines, with finding a way to reach Asia. The Portuguese, being on the western side of the Iberian Peninsula, didn't have direct access to the Mediterranean Sea. The Spaniards, of course, occupied the Mediterranean-facing portion of Iberia. The Spaniards and the Portuguese, I'm calling them Spaniards. Spain actually didn't exist as an entity yet, but for conversation's sake, let's call the kingdoms that occupied what is now modern Spain, right? So the Spaniards controlled access to the Mediterranean, and this forced the Portuguese to look westward and southward for a route to Asia, we are told. And this is the motor that drives the creation of the modern world. And this creation of the modern world reaches its satisfaction or its completion with the most famous act of the age, ironically not an act carried out by a Portuguese or at the behest of the Portuguese, and that is Columbus's discovery of quote unquote discovery of the Americas. Columbus, as we all know, travels westward out of the belief, which was a novel belief in this era for Europeans, that the world was not flat, but was indeed round, and that if he traveled west, he could find his way to Japan and to China and beyond, right? So what is it about this story that is worth deconstructing, and why is this important? And what does this deconstruction tell us about the modern world or its creation? And how does this deconstruction, the deconstruction that I offer in the book, and which I promised to sort of offer you a flavor of in this conversation, how does it put Africa at the center of this story, where I believe it belongs to be? One has to go back a century and a half or more prior to Columbus to inspect or to contemplate or assess events that were taking place in a region of Africa that we now know of as the Sahel. The Sahel is a broad band of savanna-like territory that goes from west to east across Africa, immediately to the South Sahara Desert. In the western part of the Sahel, corresponding with the nation that is the modern nation of Mali, was the heartland of a series of great empires, going back to early in the first millennium. We're not going to take this conversation quite that far back. We will, though, begin early in the 14th century, meaning in the early 1300s, when a king or an emperor, depending on which terminology one favors, of the Empire of Mali, named Abu Bakr II, gets it into his head more than a century and a half before Columbus did, that there are lands to be discovered on the far side of the Atlantic Ocean. The Malians, being a Muslim empire in this era, or at least the elite of this empire in this era, had a tradition of pilgrimage to Mecca and of contact with the Arab world. And by virtue of this contact with the Arab world, of what we now know of as the Middle East, they had access to Islamic learning in the Middle East. And since the 8th century, Islamic geographers had already posited that the world was round and had developed centuries before Europeans quite a sophisticated understanding of the true geography of the world, even if they had not explored the western shores of the Atlantic. So it's not as fanciful or even as surprising as it might seem on the face of it that an African might have wondered what exists on the other side of the modern world. Abu Bakr II, this emperor, doesn't just wonder this. He mounts 2 expeditions, not involving tall-masted ships, which West Africans did not possess in this era, but very large and sophisticated dugouts, technology that was common in West Africa and was mastered in West Africa in this era to a high level of sophistication. The first of these ventures sets out at sea, and most of the boats never return. The leader of that expedition comes back. He presents himself before the king. He describes violent ocean currents that tore the boats apart and sunk them at a certain point where 2 seas seemed to converge, one from the north, one from the south. This is a very important datum, a very important piece of information that enhances the veracity or the believability of this story. And I'll tell you why we know this story in a moment. I don't want to get ahead of myself. But the existence of violent currents that come together at a certain point in the ocean at that latitude to the west of Mali was something that Columbus would discover later on. And the pertinent current in particular that's worth noting, we now know of as the Canary Current, which at a certain latitude begins not to push traffic back toward Europe, which had been what had impeded European ocean exploration in previous ages, but just to the south of those seas that push eastward back to Europe exist currents that push strongly to the west and therefore lead to the so-called New World. So there's a record of Africans having understood this in the very beginning of the 1300s. Abu Bakr is a determined man. He receives the report of the person he had charged with this expedition of the disaster, and he says, "I'm going to do this myself. We're going to assemble even more boats, and I'm going to commandeer or lead this expedition." This leader, Abu Bakr II, never returns to coastal Africa. I'm not here to argue, and nor have I in my book, that he ever made it to the New World. There are people who speculate about such things. I don't find that to be terribly fruitful. What's interesting to me has to do with the way that Africa has been typically depicted in the accounting of the emergence of the modern world. And this is actually the sort of founding act in the erasure of Africa from a narrative that is now 600 years old. There is a history of Africans trying to cross the Atlantic that far predates the history of Europeans trying to cross the Atlantic. The next question we have to ask ourselves is, what makes this not simply just a matter of idle curiosity or kind of a Jeopardy quiz question or something like that? And the answer also has to do with erasure, but finally has to do with the events that follow. So on the erasure side, first of all, we are told, when we are not told directly, we are told by implication that Africans have never been players of any significance or note in world history, that they are basically absent from the story. Great Western thinkers, and I could cite quite a few of them, perhaps the most famous of them is Hegel, who basically said Africans live outside of history. History has nothing to do with Africans. There is no history in Africa. Okay, this leader, Abu Bakr II, who almost certainly perished at sea trying to reach the far shores of the Atlantic out of the belief that the earth was round, was not just trying to explore the ocean. He was acting out of geopolitical ambition, in my view. And I'll tell you why I believe this in a moment. My theory, as I elaborate in this book, is that Mali was and had been for a long string of centuries already the most important source of gold in world trade in Africa and Europe, was looking for new outlets for its gold. The reason it sought new outlets for its gold is because Mali's gold had traditionally been traded across the Sahara and had to pass through the hands of middlemen in Arabic-speaking North African kingdoms, who took big cuts, as all middlemen tend to do, as they passed the gold onward into Europe in trade with Europeans. And so the Malians, frustrated, I believe, by the loss of those margins to the middlemen, were seeking under Abu Bakr II a way to discover other outlets for their immense stores of gold. So we know this story for the following reason. In 1324, Abu Bakr II's successor, a man named Mansa Musa, who survives in popular culture, or at the fringes of popular culture, not everybody has heard about him, but you can encounter mentions of him here and there on the internet, with the reputation in such circles as the world's richest man ever, right? Abu Bakr II's successor, this world's richest man, was a man named Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa in 1324, the emperor of Mali, sets off on another great geopolitical gambit across the Sahara Desert to Egypt and to Mecca. His ultimate destination is to enact a pilgrimage to Mecca, but he stops with an enormous procession in Cairo, where he stays at the foot of the Great Pyramids for a series of weeks. And in his possession, with this great convoy that he traveled with over 3,500 miles, he carried with him 18 tons of pure gold. These 18 tons of pure gold during his stay were unbelievably completely distributed, exhausted in acts of patronage and religious devotion. Mansa Musa handing out gold to officials high and low and to religious figures in the Muslim world of Egypt under the Mamluk dynasty and in the Arabian Peninsula. Just to sort of tie a knot on Abu Bakr II, we know the story of his predecessor, because during a session with the Mamluk governor of Cairo, Mansa Musa is asked for the history of his dynasty in a court session with the leader of Mamluk Egypt. And Mansa Musa describes this history of Abu Bakr trying to cross the Atlantic with a lot of gold in his boats, with the belief that the earth is round and that he can reach the other side of the ocean. So this was transcribed by a court scribe in real time in 1325 in documents that survive. And so that's the basis for understanding this first gambit. The second gambit becomes important, meaning the gambit of Mansa Musa himself, because the quantity of gold that he distributed in Cairo, and beyond, was such that the traditional ratios of value between gold and silver, historically speaking, in most parts of the world, the most traditional stores of value and of bases of metals, of money. The traditional ratio whereby gold is often several multiples the price of silver reverses. So much gold had flooded the market under Mansa Musa that gold becomes cheaper than silver in Egypt. The price of gold in the broader Mediterranean world collapses for a decade or more. And word of this prodigious amount of wealth controlled by one man spreads very quickly into Europe, far into Europe. And as it spreads, this captures the imagination of the young Portuguese dynasty, which had just been born around that time, known as the Aviz dynasty, the beginnings of Portugal. And the Portuguese, being very weak and new as a dynasty on the Iberian Peninsula, had founded their dynasty by breaking away from control from what we will call, for convenience sake now, the Spanish. And the Spanish, being much larger and more prosperous, coveted reconquest of the Portuguese. And so the Portuguese are desperate by the early 1400s to figure out a way to acquire the wherewithal to assure their survival vis-a-vis the hostile Spanish. And a prince of the Aviz dynasty in the early 1400s, then who history has made familiar to us under the name Henry the Navigator, creates a venture of his own. It's actually somehow like a faint echo of what I said about Abu Bakr II. He says that the future of his kingdom, of the Aviz dynasty, is bound up in whether or not the Portuguese can become the first Europeans to discover the source of the gold, and this prodigious amount of gold known to exist since the early 1300s in West Africa. In the meantime, I skipped a little step. In the meantime, in the decades following Mansa Musa's pilgrimage, map making in Europe becomes increasingly more speculative and focused on Africa itself. So the traditional narrative that we have of the Age of Discovery typically starts with Columbus, or when not with Columbus himself, with Portuguese explorers like Vasco da Gama or Bartolomé Diaz. And as these storylines are developed, Africa, if the word Africa appears at all in these narratives, it appears in the form of, or to be described as, a geographic obstacle that had to be overcome. That the quest, the obsession of these Iberians was how to finally somehow circumnavigate Africa. In other words, how to get around Africa and thereby, for the purposes of narration of these accounts, to completely cut Africa out of the story. You can see from the telling that I've just provided you, just of the beginnings of this history, how false that is, how unfounded this is. The Portuguese obsession was, in fact, completely bound up in questing for discovery in Africa. And Henry the Navigator, beginning in the 1430s, mounts these voyages, which I have said somehow faintly echo Abu Bakr's, where he finances expeditions, naval explorations or maritime explorations of the African coast, pushing further and further south, looking desperately for the source of gold out of the belief that this is the key to Portugal's survival as a kingdom. So this is the opposite of Africa not being of interest to the Europeans, because this pursuit lasts decades, precisely. Henry the Navigator begins these efforts in the 1430s. no gold in any interesting commercial quantities is discovered right away. The Portuguese persist, and they sort of inch their way down the West African coast, little by little, starting, let's say, in Mauritania and Senegal, and finally working their way around the Grand Bulge of West Africa until they do finally discover gold in the year 1471, a year that appears in the title of my book. When the Portuguese arrive at the place where they discover gold, which is in the modern nation of Ghana, at a place they came to just know of as, or to which they give the name Elmina. They discovered, to their astonishment and delight, that even common people, gold was so abundant, even the relatively poor people of this culture wore abundant amounts of gold as adornment on their bodies and in their clothing and in their hair, etc. And so the Portuguese established themselves in a trade with these peoples, relatively minor kingdom, historically speaking, in that part of Ghana. And it's important to note that they established themselves in trade and not in conquest, because the Portuguese didn't have the means to conquer these people, even though we're talking about a relatively minor people or minor kingdom. The technological gap between Iberia and West Africa at this time was not especially large, and the Portuguese didn't have the ability to project force to the extent that would be necessary over such distances to conquer anybody. And so they set themselves up in trade with these West Africans in Ghana for the gold that they had been seeking for so long. By the way, by this time, Henry the Navigator is dead. So the Portuguese, he establishes this quest. It goes on for several decades, and it survives him. That's how important connecting with Africa had been for the Portuguese. The Portuguese discover, to their delight, that the Ghanaians were willing to trade with them for gold, but to their dismay, that the Portuguese had nothing that the Ghanaians wanted. The Portuguese had a relatively poor material culture. Their only major economic products at this time were dried fish, salt, and cork. The cork of the stuff that we used to stopper wine bottles. Those were the major products of Portugal. The Ghanaians had no use for those products. The Ghanaians were very hospitable to them, gave them samples of the gold in trade for whatever knickknacks the Portuguese had. And the Portuguese had to go back to Europe to establish new circuits of trade within Europe that become historically quite important and are also traditionally heavily de-emphasized in accounts of the emergence of the modern world. So what do I mean? I mean the Portuguese, in order to secure trade with what we're going to call Ghana, had to source goods in other parts of Europe, starting up new economic circuits within Europe that had not existed before, to acquire in places like Germany and the Low Countries metalwares and textiles that the Africans in Ghana would be interested in trading for gold. And so this is the first of, we're all familiar, I assume, with this phrase triangular trade. This is the first triangular trade that exists between Europe and Africa long before the discovery of the New World, or before, obviously, the transatlantic slave trade, with which the triangular trade phrase is most associated. The Spanish get wind of the Portuguese great success in establishing this trade in gold. In fact, Portugal's crown revenue increases. It comes to consist, within 5 years or so, 30% of its crown revenue is suddenly derived from trade with this one place in Africa. This source of gold was considered so important to the Portuguese that they named their treasury. The kingdom's treasury was named for Africa. It came to be called the Casa da Guinea, meaning the House of Guinea. Guinea was a generic name for sub-Saharan Africa used by the Portuguese in this period. And so this is, we're giving you the antithesis of this traditional narrative, which has cut Africa out of every element of this story. And we haven't even gotten to Columbus yet in terms of his grand, most famous exploration or discovery. So let's do that now. What does this have to do? How does this undermine, or how does this complicate the normal story about Columbus? Columbus, in fact, was essentially a mercenary. He was a ship captain for hire. It didn't matter to him which flag he worked for, as long as the income was sufficient. And so in this period, meaning for 2 decades, Columbus was in the employment of the Portuguese for the purposes of ferrying this new triangular trade circuit of goods back and forth between Europe and West Africa, between Elmina, this spot where the Portuguese had by this time established the first tropical fortified outpost of any European country, a fort, in other words, which they built on the coast of present-day Ghana in 1482. Columbus spent 2 decades going back and forth in the employment of the Portuguese to supply this fort with trade goods and to bring gold back to Europe. 2 other of the great explorer names of this period also did. Vasco da Gama, who I mentioned earlier, and Bartolomé Diaz also, all worked in the employment of the Portuguese. Where this becomes really interesting is that the Spanish, in the late 1470s, prior to the construction of this first Portuguese, or first European fortified outpost or fort in the tropics, the Spanish, being much bigger with much larger naval forces, much more powerful country, tried to seize control of this gold trade away from the Portuguese. They sent an enormous convoy of ships down the African coast to Elmina and tried to defeat the Portuguese at sea to take over this trade in gold. But the Portuguese, although much weaker and with a much smaller sort of naval forces, had intelligence about the Spanish bid to oust them. And so they lay in ambush and they sunk the Spanish ships and managed to hold on to this vitally important trade outpost for their kingdom. I'll just say one more thing about Columbus, then I have to move on to something else, which is of much more obvious importance, I think, or will be much more obvious of importance to your audience in terms of the grand sweep of this history. I've just gotten us going, but Columbus, it is important to understand, had spent much of these 2 decades I've spoken about in his free time wandering the courts of Europe, trying to persuade people to back him in a venture to try to do what Abu Bakr II had done in the early 1300s, to cross the Atlantic in pursuit of discovery of new lands and hopefully of Asia. And he had been laughed out of court in one place after another. The Spanish had turned him down, the English had turned him down, the Portuguese had turned him down, possibly others had turned him down. When the Portuguese hit the jackpot in terms of establishing this enormously lucrative trade with what we're calling Ghana, the Spanish then decided, out of envy, to back Columbus. They said, well, if there's gold in tropical places like this, we can't let Portugal run away with all of the loot, speaking colloquially, right? We have to get into this game too. And so it's at that point that the Spanish reconsider and backed Columbus's ventures. This is the origin of how Columbus, A, mastered sea navigation. It was going back and forth to West Africa and understanding the Canary Current, and B, found backing for the great voyages of discovery that he would later make. All of these events have their roots in West Africa. So what were the Portuguese doing in the meantime? The Portuguese believed, much as the Spanish did, that the distribution of gold and silver and precious metals in the world, since it had been discovered in such high quantities in Ghana, maybe had something to do with geographic distribution, and that at certain latitudes on either side of the equator, close to the equator, they had this theory that there must be lots of gold. This was another sort of propelling force behind Columbus's discoveries. He thought that at such latitudes, he would be able to discover gold because the Portuguese had at similar latitudes. Okay, so the Portuguese, instead of running onward to Asia, which is the normal story we are told, obsessed with getting to Asia, Africa is a mere obstacle, the Portuguese begin out of this theory of sort of the geographic distribution of gold in the tropics, exploring other parts of Africa nearby. And they would do this for the next 2 decades prior to any attempt whatsoever of reaching Asia. So we're told that Asia is everything, but nobody has paused to say, well, if Asia is everything and they finally have the ability to master sea navigation at great distance from Europe, why is it that they were hanging around in Africa not trying to get to Asia? And the reasons for that are quite interesting, and not just interesting, important, decisive in understanding the beginnings of the modern age. So the Portuguese, in a few years after establishing the trade with Elmina in Ghana, are continuing to explore, looking for gold at those latitudes, and off the coast of Central Africa, right on the equator virtually, they discover an island which we know of as Sao Tome. Sao Tome is absent from most books of world history or of the start of the modern age, but I want to argue to you is the site of the most important innovation, economically speaking, in the history of the modern age prior to the Industrial Revolution. So why do I say this? The Portuguese, just before the discovery of Sao Tome, had begun very recently experimenting in the farming of sugarcane and the production of refined sugar far to the north in the Atlantic, in places like Madeira and in the Canary Islands. And they were eager to produce sugar because sugar was an exorbitant luxury item that only so rare that it could only be consumed by the richest people in Europe. And so the Portuguese saw potential for great profit in producing refined sugar, which 99% of Europeans never ever tasted, right? And so the Portuguese arrive in Sao Tome, tropical island, volcanic island, right on the equator, irrigated with seasonal rains of great abundance, and somebody gets the bright idea to try to plant some saplings of sugarcane or seedlings of sugarcane, and it just explodes. It proves to be, ecologically speaking, pretty much the perfect place to grow sugar. There's only one thing that's missing. The one thing that's missing is labor. Sugar, everywhere it has been grown in world history, has been associated with forced labor, if not forced labor, with outright slavery. And that is because the conditions under which sugar thrives are quite particular. It can only grow, or it can only be grown profitably if planted very densely in a tropical place with abundant rainfall. And the sugar is a type of grass, but it's a very specific type of grass with extremely sharp leaves. And so to plant this crop, you have to wander in rich, muddy soils in the tropics, inundated with rain, and the whole time you're being cut, you're being sliced up by the leaves of the plant because they're planted so densely together. And so this is why sugar has been, even prior to the stories that I'm telling you, long associated with slavery or with prison labor or other kinds of forced labor. And the Portuguese then begin to bring Africans who they have bought, they have captured in some instances, or purchased from parts of the West African or nearby Central African coast to Sao Tome. And it is in this place, in this specific place and time, that this ultra important economic institution, I've called it an innovation, even though it's a horrible innovation, the plantation, emerges in its full form. The plantation that would so characterize the later takeoff, economically speaking, of European colonialism in the Western Hemisphere, is born on Sao Tome, a place that typically goes unmentioned in the history books. Plantation agriculture, or the plantation, I believe very strongly, is a word that we need to work our way away from, that we need to complicate or reject it ultimately. And that is because it is such a euphemism. I think that a better or more accurate way to think of a plantation, this new institution, this new innovation, is more akin to a prison industrial labor camp. In other words, the enslaved people are in effect prisoners. They're working under high quasi-military supervision. They're being corporally punished constantly in order to eke ever-increasing production out of them. And in fact, they're being worked to death. They're being worked to death as part of not as a byproduct, but it's the actual business plan of the plantation. Plantations, this prettified term of the plantation, starts out with the idea that the lives of the people who are being put to work in these prison industrial labor settings are utterly dispensable. And in fact, the life expectancy of enslaved peoples in Sao Tome, and then subsequently in the so-called New World, wherever sugar comes to be grown, is between 5 and 7 years, meaning from the moment that you started work under conditions of enslavement until your death is going to be on average 5 to 7 years. That's how brutal the work regime was. Okay, so this all comes together on Sao Tome, but there's another very particular feature, a historically decisive feature associated with, and that is that not just anybody is a slave or is eligible for enslavement, but people of a specific race are equated with eligibility for slavery. In other words, their racial identity automatically subjects them in the thinking of Europeans to the legitimate subjugation into slavery. And their race is, as you all will know, and won't have much difficulty guessing, was African, or as we would say in contemporary parlance, Black. That Blackness becomes equated for the first time with slavery in an absolute way in the minds of Europeans for the purposes of the development of this business model, this innovation, as I've spoken of it, in prison labor industrial camp settings aimed at producing refined sugar from sugarcane, grinding lives into the ground in remarkably short period of time, 5 to 7 years on average for individuals. There's a we could spend a whole hour talking about this institution, and maybe those of you who are interested in this will read the book, and I go into this in much greater length in its pages. But the other feature that we can't neglect to describe is a familiar term to many of you, which is chattel. So it's not only that Africans are the people who have been enlisted in the minds of Europeans as the legitimate targets of enslavement, but it's a new, historically speaking, in world historical terms, it's a new form of enslavement. The racial basis of the slavery is new, but there's something else that is also new, and this is where this sort of revolves around the meaning of the word chattel. Chattel has the same root as the Latin word for cattle, and that's no accident or coincidence. Chattel slavery means the reduction of these peoples who have been enlisted for the purposes of extracting labor from them under militarized conditions to bestiality. And as with beasts, this means that slavery is transgenerational, that not only are the people who are caught up in the enslavement in the present moment going to die as slaves, but that if they should be productive, meaning fecund, meaning if they should reproduce and have offspring, that their offspring will automatically become slaves and become the property, indeed the capital of the owners of the plantation, and that their offspring's offspring will become slaves, on and on in perpetuity. This is new in world historical terms. And so all of this comes together in Sao Tome for the first time, and by a matter of geographic and sort of navigational accident, it transits the Atlantic in the early decades of the 16th century, meaning the early 1500s, when Portuguese discovered Brazil. They discovered Brazil not because they were looking for it, but because they had discovered a navigational technique they were not trying to get to Asia. They were still working very hard to explore Africa, looking for gold elsewhere. And they discovered a navigational technique whereby to get down the coast of Africa, they found that it was much quicker, instead of hugging the coast, to sail out to the west far at sea and then cut back in, like pursuing the next leg of a triangle. And by forming these larger and larger triangles of navigation, they ultimately sailed so far to the west. At that latitude, Brazil is actually not so far distant from Central Africa, but they sailed so far to the west that they hit Brazil. Eureka, they've discovered a new continent. And so almost immediately the chattel slavery, prison industrial labor camp system transits the Atlantic with them. With a little twist, the Portuguese initially tried to enslave the abundant Native American population, but these people die off. They also resist and die off in very large numbers, mostly for reasons of disease transmission. And then sort of mid-16th century, we see the full flush of the transatlantic slave trade for the first time. And this is happening simultaneously in the Spanish colonies of Cuba and of Mexico and of Hispaniola, where for the first time, large numbers of Africans are being brought across the sea in chains by the Europeans for the purposes of extracting labor from them in the settings and through this innovative institution that I've described for you. I'm going to try to go really quickly now because I want to save enough time for discussion. But I want to, in the concluding parts of my opening remarks, I want to sort of, we all think we know the broad outlines of the story of slavery. You might have a number in your mind, how many slaves, were landed in the New World. You might have kind of a rote kind of junior high or high school notion of how important this was, economically speaking, to Europe or to the new colonies of Europe in the New World. I want to challenge your sense of knowledge about how important this was. The most famous stories of wealth creation in this age, meaning in the 16th century, are the stories that come down to us of Spanish conquest. The conquistadors, these small bands of men in armor and horseback who ride into the teeth of the great empires of native peoples in the New World and conquer them. And in the next breath, we hear of their carting off enormous stores of gold or silver back to Spain, and how this creates literally the century that is known for Spain of the Golden Century, because of the metals that were carted back in boats that were specially designed for this function. Fat-bellied ships called galleons, which were the supercargoes of the day, right? So this is the story we understand. It's the traditional story of the great boom in wealth that Europe acquired in this age. That actually, so this is the era when Europe first starts to diverge in wealth from other parts of the world, always having trailed previously India and China for a long string of centuries. In fact, this prison industrial labor system, based on sugar, but later adding on other crops, a series of other crops, and we can get into what those crops were, and I'm going to mention prominently one of them in a few minutes. Already in this beginning, between the late 16th century and the middle of 17th century, already agriculture from enslaved Africans is producing for Europe more wealth than the Spanish gold and silver. The Spanish gold and silver is the famous story. The African story is the anonymous story, the story that gets left out of these accounts because there are no grand European figures, and there's actually nothing to be proud of, right? And so this is documented in my book. You don't have to take my word for it. Solid, financially based assessments of how much wealth was derived from what type of imperial activity by different nations. It is clear that already in Brazil, more money is being made from African labor than the Spanish were able to steal in terms of gold and silver from the New World. Then begins a really interesting transit. So in 1630, England takes over the island of Barbados. Barbados had been uninhabited at that time, and seeing the great wealth of Spain and Portugal in this era, copies Portuguese techniques in Barbados, and in a remarkably short period of time. So the English show up in 1630. By 1650, their business model is almost identical to the Portuguese business model. Chattel slavery, prison, industrial labor camps, sugar. In the second half of the 17th century, on the island of Barbados, Britain gets onto its feet as an imperial power for the first time. This is the start of British Empire, and Britain earns more money in the second half of the 17th century in this one place, rubbing out the lives of hundreds of thousands of Africans in the pursuit of the production of sugar than the Spanish had acquired in Bolivia and Peru or Mexico. Barbados, to give you an extent of how extraordinary this is equivalent to the size of 1/3 of the surface area of the city of Los Angeles. 1/6 of Long Island. I'm from New York, so 1/6 of Long Island here in New York. It's a tiny place. In that tiny place, this model produces that much wealth, more wealth than the conquistadors and the Spanish galleons of the Age of Gold in Spain had been able to achieve. This is Britain, it's still England, by the way. This is the start of England as a power. It begins in, excuse me, it begins in Barbados, and then both the English and the French are racing to catch up with the Portuguese and the Spanish, and the Spanish having these vast territories that they controlled in the Americas, and the larger islands of the Caribbean had neglected the smaller islands of the Caribbean, Lesser Antilles. The Spanish had vast naval forces. The English and the French in this time are far weaker. And so the Spanish have left the Lesser Antilles, and as the English were doing this in Barbados, the French begin to exploit under the same model Guadeloupe and Martinique to produce sugar with very similar results. And this moves like a chain up the arc of the Caribbean. The English, once they get the wealth out of Barbados and Africans producing sugar for them there, they have the wherewithal to take on the Spanish, and they beat the Spanish to take over Jamaica. Jamaica is a much bigger island than Barbados. The wealth creation explodes for England in this period, even further. Then the French, envious of the success of by this point the British, then create a sugar colony out of their holdings on Hispaniola, the western third of the island of Hispaniola. The other third was controlled by Spain. And between 1730, when the French first started to grow sugar on Hispaniola, till the 1780s, or by the 1780s, Saint-Domingue, the name of the French colony, becomes the source of 1/3 of all of France's external trade. This one place, which we know of as Haiti, it is the source by virtue of this economic model, this horrible innovation that I've spoken to, the source of 1/3 of all of the external trade of France. This is France's golden century. This is the century when France really rises to great wealth and power in Europe. And it is on the backs of this model that this all happens. In 1791, decisive world historical events take place in that setting. Africans, and I'm calling them Africans. I told you I would emphasize Africans in the beginning of this talk. Africans rise up against the French and against their bondage. I'm calling them Africans because if the life expectancy is 5 to 7 years from time of arrival, then anybody who arrived and was put to work growing sugar on that island would be culturally the same person that they were when they arrived. In other words, the French were bringing people deliberately, as were the English, wherever they had plantation colonies, from disparate parts of Africa, hoping to forestall concertation and conspiracy among them to pursue their own liberty and rebel. Despite that, the Africans in 1791 rise up in rebellion against the French, and some of the most remarkable events in world history proceed from that. The Africans successfully overthrow French rule. Then come the Spanish, thinking, oh, if the French have been defeated, we can take over the rest of the island. We already have 2/3 of it. The Africans defeat the Spanish. Then come the British. British say, this is ready for our plucking. We somehow neglected to control the richest sugar growing area of the entire Caribbean. The French got it. Now the French lost it. We should take it. The British send the largest naval convoy in their history to try to defeat the Africans of Saint-Domingue, and the Africans win. This is not emphasized in major histories of the modern era, certainly not in standard curriculum. The British lost more soldiers trying to take Saint-Domingue by a very large distance than they lost in the vastly more famous American Revolution. The Africans defeated the British. Then the French come back one more time under Napoleon and tried to restore slavery in Hispaniola, in Saint-Domingue, and the Africans win yet again. And so the Africans win 3 times, actually 4 times, against the 3 great empires of the modern age. Each time they win, and in the 4th time, the ultimate time, defeating Napoleon, a series of absolutely extraordinary things happen. First, we see the very first true enactment of this most central values of the Enlightenment. It is in Haiti, among Africans, from the very birth of their republic, in their founding document, their constitution, that the most central value of the Enlightenment is instituted and becomes a character of law, takes on the character of law, that all people are created equal. We think of that phrase in terms of the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The American Revolution is earlier, but as we all know, all people were not created equal in the American Revolution. This takes force in Haiti for the very first time in world history. And this should give you pause to understand, this fact alone should give you pause to contemplate the sort of trivialized ways in which the participation of Africans in world history is operated. But in the interest of time, we have to move on to the final sort of chapter of this story. And that is that Napoleon, by virtue of trying to hold on to Haiti and conquer, put down the slave revolt twice, nearly bankrupts France. And by virtue of nearly bankrupting France, he is forced to sell his holdings in North America, in continental America, actually in the United States. And he sells a vast territory, which we know of as the Louisiana Purchase. This is all or part of 15 American states. It doubles the size of the United States overnight under the Thomas Jefferson administration. And something else very special happens. American politics, meaning the politics of the United States, had been dominated by the states of the Old South, the plantation, the prison industrial labor system South, up until that point. And the conservative founding generation of leaders who ruled in the South took horror at the events of Haiti, thinking that if the enslaved Africans could defeat the three great imperial powers of the world on the island of Hispaniola, maybe they can defeat our enslavement of Africans on the American mainland. Therefore, we must disperse these people and reduce their concentrations in our midst and put them to work in other parts of our vast new territory. So the Louisiana Purchase isn't just a geographic kind of boondoggle for the young United States, but it becomes a political boondoggle for the founders of the Old South, where they think of themselves as being able to distance themselves from the peril, the perceived peril of a slave uprising. And so they send 1 million descendants of Africans on a trek by foot across the vast expanse of the United States to the Mississippi Valley and put them into the production of cotton, the new king commodity of the era, under the same economic institution that we saw emerge in Sao Tome, and to the most stunning historic effects so far in this entire narration of stunning economic events. In the Mississippi Valley, from the early 1790s, when no cotton was grown, until the Civil War in the United States, well, actually by 1830, cotton was already, by 1830, starting from zero in 1790, by 1830, cotton was the principal trade export of the United States by a long distance. By the 1830s, the production of cotton in this prison industrial labor setting was measured in the low hundreds of millions. By the Civil War, the United States was producing 2 billion pounds of cotton per year, all under this economic system. And this becomes, and I'm going to end with this, this becomes, in a way that has also been neglected, a principal aspect or element in, so I called the prison industrial labor complex the most important economic innovation of the modern age after the Industrial Revolution. But this cotton boom eked out of Africans through that labor complex is actually the supplier of the raw material that is the basis for the Industrial Revolution. In other words, we tell a story about the Industrial Revolution traditionally in most of our history books and in the way this is taught, of English ingenuity, of organizing labor, and of creating cotton looms to spin cotton. And gathering people together to work under one place, under roof, and the birth of the factory. And there was indeed ingenious sort of creation involved in such elaboration and perfection of such processes. But in telling the story that way, we cut out of the picture the fact that the product, the commodity that these products derive from, cotton, we've cut it completely out of the picture. And I don't have the decade by decade numbers right in front of me to recite to you, but the point I want to leave you with is the productivity of production, or the quantity of production of cotton in the United States, where 1 out of 13 people in the young United States was, and almost all of them Africans or descendants of Africans, were employed or were bound up in the production of cotton. The output of cotton increases necessarily in lockstep with the output of British textiles. And the reason they are in lockstep is because all of the British textiles are made from cotton produced in these slave industrial settings. So I think I will stop with my introductory remarks there. Adrian, I know that you wanted me to speak about the moment, so to speak, where we are right now, and into which my book was sort of born, if you will. And I'll just say very quickly that I began work on this book 10 years ago in terms of reading and research. And for a project like this, nobody could do it. It's a fool's errand to try to anticipate what the zeitgeist is going to be like, or what the sort of conversation is going to be like when the book arrives at market. This is an author of a book like this has enough to worry about without trying to predict where the political conversation is going to be. But having said that, this book did arrive in a very particular political moment in the United States. And I watched it with a little bit of anxiety or trepidation as I was in the very final editing stages of the book. It was too late to sort of alter my account in any fundamental way, but tremendous things were happening in the society from which I speak, your neighbor, the United States to the south, and more broadly in a number of Western countries, where the place of people of African descent in these societies was coming under re-examination, and where resistance to present-day oppression was being energized in the first instance as a response to acts of police brutality, as in the killing of a man named George Floyd in the United States. And this led to, as most of you will probably know, to great acts of iconoclasm, meaning the smashing of monuments here and there, as people mulled over, ruminated about how we are taught our history, and how this has led to the celebration of false idols, people who were actually deeply involved with acts of evil and of moral horror in the past, who we have elevated and who we had elevated in past eras to herodom, and had never paused to re-examine as time went on until this moment, as you have phrased it in our conversation, Adrian, arrived. And so my book arrives in this moment, and my book arrives with a particular hope, and that is, not having planned to arrive in this moment, that it can help in its own modest way nudge our conversations further in a very particular direction. The direction is, what I have in mind here is that we need to understand, first of all, how integrated the history of the Atlantic world is. That thinking about our histories as nation states is a way of blinding ourselves to the real nature of our history, to the true texture of this history, and to the roles of truly important actors and of agents and of peoples that have been written out of accounts. And one of the best examples of that is what I said about Haitian history. The events that took place in Haiti at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century shaped the entire history of the Atlantic world. There's a very famous quote in my book from Voltaire. I don't know how familiar Canadians are with this, but Voltaire, the great French writer in the 18th century, had a great quip about it was a much better idea to sell off or to trade off the vast expanses of snow of Canada back to the English in exchange for the tiny little sugar islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe. That is how much world historical significance was bound up in the processes that I've described to you. So the first hope that I have is of making people, whether they are Europeans, Western Europeans especially, or whether they are North Americans, or whether they are South Americans, or people of the Caribbean, or of West and Central Africa, or Africa more broadly, to understand how densely interwoven the history of the Atlantic world is. And then my final hope is that peoples of African descent in Africa and of the African diaspora arrive through an appreciation of this interwoven history at a way of overcoming petty chauvinisms that I think have divided the African diaspora to their harm. In other words, African Americans have a great history and have much to be proud of and much to agonize over, but they don't spend enough time thinking about how their history is one with this much broader Atlantic history. I don't know Canadian historical debates well enough to pronounce myself in much the same way, but I suspect that somebody who observes such things could say something similar. Brazilians are caught up in their own inwardly looking chauvinism and to the neglect of their incredible role in this broader history. People of the Caribbeans, much the same is true. And Africans of West and Central Africa, regions of the world I have deep and long experience with. Very often, I've had so many conversations where that history of the people that were taken away, that's not really our history. That doesn't, it's kind of a sad story, but it doesn't have anything to do with us. Nothing could be further from the truth. The situation that we find ourselves in, all of us, along this rim of the Atlantic Ocean, is bound up in the circumstances of this interwoven history. And so this book is written in that spirit of helping bring us together around these common themes.
Well, Howard, thank you so much for that very comprehensive and trenchant intervention, that presentation.
So this has been quite long, much longer than I intended to stream today. But the history was so fascinating. I don't know what you take away from there, but it's just so paradigm shifting. It's just so mind blowing. It's just a completely new perspective and a new look on history that I gained from this presentation. And that's the reason why I decided to share. In the fact that the word that African had sailed out of Africa, that Abubakar II had sailed out of Africa long before Columbus, centuries before Columbus attempted his so-called discovery trips. It's just mind blowing. It's new. I mean, I had heard about this, but from this perspective that Howard French presents, is really, really very powerful. And when I look at the fact that that the Portuguese actually got their riches from Ghana. The gold that they got from Ghana helped them to reposition themselves in Europe. I mean, this is powerful. And then bringing it right back to the country where I am right now, Sao Tome, and understanding that this country played an eminent role, and that it was actually the first place where the plantation concept, the plantation concept was developed the way it has been meted out to the rest of the world, makes it even more fascinating and more interesting. And sometimes I have the feeling that some of the places that I talk about are places that I have been to. And one moment, please. One moment, I'm online now. So when I understand that, and also the fact that 2 days ago, I was on the street and I saw the place, a memorial place that is in honor of the first slave revolution and the people that were murdered. And I did not understand the scope of this uprise and the global scope of this place. And so listening to Howard French really opens my mind big to see the world differently and to explore this island to see what other historical traces are here that have been hidden, that have been neglected, that have been ignored, so that we rewrite history from our perspective. So thank you for having tuned in. Arthur Kitolo, I see you. Thank you for joining in on LinkedIn. This stream is live. Please share so that we learn history together, because this is just incredible when we get to know history from this point of view. So I don't know Howard French, but his book is definitely very much recommended. And if you can get that book and read, I'm sure that you'll get much more. And he's written some other books that I'm quite interested in. So that said, this was it for today. I hope you took away as much as I did. And next Friday, I will be back with another episode on Open Call from Sao Tome, and I will be sharing something new. So I'll figure out what is it that I'll share. You just want to keep your eyes open and watch out for whatever is going to come next Friday. But it's definitely going to be another mind-blowing, another eye-opening episode of the Open Call. My name is Ankweta Beatrice Achaleke. It was my pleasure to share this history moment with you. And I'll see you next week. Stay blessed and stay safe.